Well, welcome to the Kennedy School Forum and to this preview showing and discussion of Frontline's Secrets of the SAT. I'm Tom Patterson. I'm acting director of the Shorenstein Center on Press Politics and Public Policy and also the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press here at the Kennedy School. I'll be moderating tonight's program. I think they asked me to moderate because I seem to have a small personal stake in SATs. My children are still too young to have gone through that particular ordeal. And I grew up in that wonderful state of Minnesota where we use the ACTs and not the SATs. But in fact, we all have a deep stake if we're interested in equal opportunity and in higher education in the SATs. I think we all share a basic premise of the SATs, their initial intent, which was to level the playing field, to make merit rather than family connections the basis for admission to the nation's best institutions of higher education. But we also would share a concern about whether something has happened along the way, whether differences in the capacity of students because of family circumstances to prepare or not prepare, to know even about the SATs and their importance, and then also the question of whether cultural differences intersect with the SATs in ways where learning capacities, knowledge differences play a part in the test scores. And I'm somewhat of a novice at the SATs, but we have a panel here that's deeply informed about this subject. What we're going to do, though, is cut directly to the film, and then I'll introduce the panelists after we've seen the preview. The producer of this film, and let me mention first the senior producer, she's here, Sharon Tiller, but the producer of this film is sitting up here, Michael Chandler, and previously he wrote and edited 2 Academy Award-nominated documentaries, Freedom on My Mind and Waldo Salt, and the Emmy-winning Yosemite. He has also edited feature films, including one of my favorites, Amadeus. Michael Chandler.
Thanks, Tom. What you're going to be seeing is an excerpt from the film. It's very hard to be able to judge a work when you only have a piece of it, but what I'm trying to do with this section is keep it within the confines of the panel and still give you a taste of what the film says. What happens, but this comes from more the second half of the film. And we introduced 7 kids, I think you're going to meet 4 here, who are applying to the University of California at Berkeley. The film started almost over a year and a half ago. Sharon originally started it at the journalism school at California, where Frontline has a Frontline West office. And it's gone through several transformations of just how we wanted to get the issue across. It's not just about the SAT. It's also about the considerations of diversity on campus and race and the use of it in college admissions. And we broadened it as we began to do the show into how do we define merit and how should we define merit and what are our assumed standards that we use for that, and should we be accepting them or questioning them, and that's what the film is designed to do. In the piece that you haven't seen that leads up to this, we collaborated with Nick Lemon, who unfortunately his plane has been delayed. But Nick was writing a book, The Big Test, The Secret History of the American Meritocracy. And he gives us a brief history of it. One of the scenes that you won't be seeing, I go down to Laguna Beach, where 13-year-old kids have started on a 5-year course to prep for their SATs. Cost them $500 a year. And they tell you how they want to go to Stanford, and Dartmouth, and Yale. And one mom is saying that when I ask what her goals are for her son, and I think she's going to say to be happy and live a fulfilling life, she says a 1600. So that's where we're sort of starting from. And we then go to the University of California, where it's literally what we call in the film is ground zero in the admissions battle. Since 2009, when Proposition 209, which banned the use of race in college admissions in the UC system, was passed, minority numbers at Cal plummeted. And the question was, how was the university going to respond to this? And that's the question we ask before we start to meet our various kids. At the time where the show picks up, we've already met a Chinese-American girl in Chinatown, a Latino boy down in an agricultural community south of the Bay Area, and a white boy who wrestles and plays the violin, and at Lowell High School, the elite Lowell High School. And this is where the film goes. So we'll take it up to the point where the kids start to get their acceptance letters, which means if you want to find out, then you can watch on Tuesday night.
In a few days, millions of American teenagers will take a test that will determine their future. They have spent thousands of hours and thousands of dollars obsessed with higher scores. But what do the SATs really measure? And are they fair? Tonight on Frontline, the real secrets of the SAT. Betsy's classmate at Kennedy High, J.K. Delane, is also working hard on his application to Berkeley.
Am I nervous? Yeah, in a way, because it kind of seems like it's kind of hard to put, what you've been working for your whole entire life into like one little folder, you know what I mean?
J.K. is president of the senior class, member of 2 school clubs, plays 3 sports, has 2 internships, and works a job after school.
Hey, guys. Hey, what's another quality? I got like leadership, persistence, and I think I have a pretty good chance to get in. I worked throughout my high school career, played sports, senior class president, homecoming king, president, vice president of various clubs. But the only thing that's maybe holding me back is my SAT scores.
J.K.'s SAT scores are a low 850, but his GPA has been improving. It's now 3.5, and he is hoping the admissions office will find worthwhile the story of how he overcame hardship on the path to college.
But I learned that if one is persistent enough, like my mother, you can get out of any dire situation. Like, I wanted to escape the norm that almost every African-American male has to deal with. I didn't fall short to fast cash, criminal behavior, or drug addiction. Instead, I struggled to make it. I did not want to be the person asking for change at the gas station. I wanted to be someone. I couldn't really figure out what I wanted to do in life. I couldn't really figure it out. I always knew that I was going to be something successful, however, but that I just didn't know at what. As soon as I got a position to be in the field of journalism, it's kind of like that was my passion, and I had to work for it. So I tried hard. Camera 2's live. And my GPA went up. I started researching colleges, but my SAT scores, that's the only thing that's holding me back. And I really feel sorry for that. I really do. Sometimes I get depressed about that, but it's also my mom. She influences me. She tells me every time I speak with her, the SAT scores, they don't just look at your SAT scores. You're a good, well-rounded student. They don't just look at your SAT scores.
The level of obsession over these tests is way out of proportion to what they actually measure. People don't realize this. It's not built to measure your innate worth or anything like that. It's built to predict 15% of the variance in freshman year grades in college. I mean, that's a fairly small thing for a test to do. It's predict 15% of the variance in freshman year grades in college. But it does that.
The sole scientific claim made by the SAT, when you get down to the bottom line and strip away all the rhetoric and nonsense, is its capacity to predict first-year grades. Well, young women get higher grades than young males across the country in colleges, despite the fact that they earn lower SAT scores by about 40 points on the average. There's only two ways to square that circle. Either all the colleges in the country are wrong, they're biased towards girls and give them higher grades than they deserve, or there's something fundamentally flawed about the test.
Open your test booklet to the general directions.
Ever since standardized testing began, one of the most consistent findings in all of standardized testing from the very beginning is that the better educated and prosperous parents produce children who score better on standardized tests. The SAT tends to reproduce the class system from generation to generation, not to turn it on its head. If Conant were alive today and he saw the incredible energy and money that the haves in America put into using essentially his test to make sure their children will be haves also, I think he'd be severely disappointed by that. He thought the test would cancel out the advantage that parents can pass on to children, and it just doesn't do that.
In the wealthy suburb of Orinda, Miramonte High School sent 30 kids to Cal last year. Marlo Schindler is one of Miramonte's best students. She is applying to several elite universities around the country, including Berkeley.
Gone the sun from the lakes. Growing up in a suburban environment, in a bubble or whatever, I think I'd like to go somewhere that's more diverse, where people aren't all identical and dressed the same.
Basically, we're making lemonade out of lemons here. They asked you to talk about the adversity you faced, and what you're going to do is come clean and say, I have faced very little adversity. Okay.
Because Marlo is taking several AP courses, her GPA is 4.3, and her SATs are also a very high 1500.
Oh, come on, I liked that.
WASP, that's not going to help. There are days when Marlo's up till 1 in the morning, and I feel badly about that, but there's sleep aplenty in the grave, and you can either work your tail off in high school and college, or you can spend your life in a series of jobs that involve name tags, hair nets, and the phrase, would you like fries with that?
For the Ivies, I'm applying to Harvard, Brown, Yale, Columbia, UPenn. For the
Berkeley is Marlo's backup school. Her first choice is the Ivy League.
Applying to 14 schools seems like sort of an overkill, but I guess I've heard enough stories about girls very much like her with equivalent backgrounds, very equivalent, who've been turned down at many of these schools.
For another Miramonte senior, Fred Ahn, Berkeley is his first choice for college, and he's taken a very unusual road to try to get there. At 15, Fred moved from his home state of Washington to a condo near Orinda, where he has lived by himself for the past 2 years, to better his chances of going to Berkeley as a California resident.
Ever since like 8th grade, my parents wanted me to move down to California. It was a hard decision for both of us. Now I'm here right next to the campus, and I feel that if I went to Berkeley, and then, I'd probably have a better chance of getting a good job so I could lead a decent life. Everybody's always separated from their family one time in their life, So, earlier you go through it, maybe the better it'll be in your life, It's hurt a little bit.
Fred has a 3.5 GPA, and his SAT score is 1150, well below the Berkeley average.
You can put in any prices you want, and you can
Well, my biggest worry is my SAT scores. A higher SAT score probably helped me to get into Berkeley, because it seems like they're really based on numbers, you know.
To push his score higher, Fred took an SAT prep course, which cost his parents over $800.
We will do anything for my children if that helps their future or education.
Education is first. We don't care how much it's gonna cost.
Okay, vocabulary words.
97% of all students in high school use some kind of test prep. But within that universe is a world of difference. In Manhattan, students pay $500 an hour for private tutors. J.K. Delane took a free course at his high school.
J.K., your teacher didn't understand what you said. Could you please say it again?
All the angles on the outside of a triangle equal 360.
Right. Okay.
So what's bigger, 360 or 180?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's so clever.
I took a course at my school, but in all actuality, I was sort of kind of teaching my teacher.
It's a rule.
If you get a low score, it'll haunt you for the rest of your life.
First time I took the SAT score, my score was 1070, and then I had my dad buy me a CD-ROM to help my SAT score out, and then I improved my score to 1200. I wasn't really aware of the courses to improve my SAT score, and when I did, I found out they're really expensive, so I'll just stick with my CD-ROM.
This is a test where everybody's saying, look, we're just being an incredibly fair society here. Everybody takes this test, and the better kids go to the better schools. And it's just bullshit. You know, the better kids hire me.
How do you know that the scores that you're seeing, whether they're the result of some kid walking in and taking the test cold on a Saturday morning, and the results of some other kid who's been tutored for $700 at the Princeton Review or Kaplan, or $1,500 for some tutor who comes to your house and drills you on the test? Those scores don't mean the same thing.
It really is a crime. What the crime is not that the SAT is used for admissions. The crime is that courses like the Advanced Placement Program, qualified teachers, the opportunity to be engaged in more rigorous courses and be expected to perform at higher levels, that opportunity is not uniform across all schools and across all communities, irrespective of where one lives.
JK woke up late last night trying to study, and he's not really in a very good mood. Yeah?
Do you have any extra pencils? No, because all I have is like all mechanical pencils.
In the fall of 1998, J.K. Delane and the other kids we followed have a last chance to raise their SAT scores.
Okay, so are you ready for the test? But just do the best you can, that's about all you can do.
Pretty much.
Say your prayers and just go get it.
Good morning and welcome. This morning you will take the SAT 1 reasoning test. Testing will begin in a few minutes. First, listen carefully to the instructions that I must read. Print your last name, first name.
I couldn't sleep last night because the SATs really, I sort of crammed in all the things I learned over the summer from Kaplan.
And begin work.
The test is really long and hard, but now it starts. When are my scores going to be sent? But other than that, I'm relieved. I'm very happy that it's over.
The tests have been graded and the scores are ready. In his condo near Orinda, Fred Ahn is certain he has to score above 1,300 to have a shot at Berkeley.
Your SAT 1 test scores are verbal 640, math 710.
Fred's combined score was 1,350. It had jumped 200 points.
Before I got 970 on my own, after Kaplan I got 1110 for my SAT scores. They sort of saved me.
What was your score?
I don't want to say. I don't want to say. I really don't want to say. I mean, but it was really depressing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, and I was thinking about, you know, where, okay, when I opened my my SAT envelope with my test scores, you know, I was thinking back of, you know, where did I go wrong? And I kind of came to the conclusion that, you know, maybe I didn't start my life off college bound, per se. You know what I mean? And maybe if I was on that track earlier enough, maybe I could have passed, maybe I could have got a better score on the test or whatnot. Who knows? You know what I mean? That's something you'll never will know.
J.K. told us later his score was 880, hardly any improvement. At Stanford University, psychology professor Claude Steele has spent several years investigating the large score gap between whites and blacks on standardized tests. Was the cause class difference, lower incomes, poorer schools, or something else?
We tend to think of standardized test scores, almost the term standardized test gives the image that this is a test that is standardized. It's fair for everybody. It is a fair and impartial measure of school potential to succeed in school. And this research, I think, raises at least one source of concern about that different groups in the midst of those tests may be under different degrees of pressure, and their performance is likely to reflect that.
Hi, are you two here for the psych study?
In research conducted at Stanford, Steele administered a difficult version of the graduate record exam, a standardized test like the SAT.
Hey, come on in and take a seat.
To one set of black and white sophomores, he indicated that the test was an unimportant research tool. To other groups, that the test was an accurate measure of their verbal and reasoning ability.
We're studying verbal reasoning ability and mental processes that are associated with performance on verbal reasoning tests.
Blacks who believed the test was merely a research tool did the same as whites. But blacks who believed the test measured their abilities did half as well. Steele calls the effect stereotype threat.
And if you're a member of a group whose intellectual abilities are negatively stereotyped, this threat might occur, that is, the negative stereotype might be applicable, will be applicable to you right in the middle of a standardized test, an important standardized test. And our general reasoning was, well, maybe this threat, this prospect of confirming a stereotype or being seen that way would be distracting enough, upsetting enough to undermine a person's performance right there in the middle of the test.
Okay, you can go ahead and begin, and I'll stop you when time is up.
Surprisingly, Steele finds the threat strongest among the best students.
What we're finding is poor performance among people who are almost trying too hard. They're rereading the items, rechecking their answers, double guessing. And on standardized tests, that's not the most effective way to take them. It becomes clear that underperformance is no mystery. It's amazing it isn't worse than it is. You know, I don't want to be shy here. This is where I feel that it's appropriate to consider race, because race is a systematic influence on test performance.
Steele's findings are not limited to black-white stereotypes. He has also reproduced the results with white women testing against white men, and white men against Asian men. In each case, the group feeling itself negatively viewed lived down to its own expectations.
If you take white males who are very invested in math again, graduate engineering students, as we did in one case, or undergraduate honors students in math, these are very good math students. You sit them down, just as you saw today in these experiments, and tell them just before they take the test that, gee, this is a test on which Asians tend to do better than whites. And lo and behold, those students underperform.
Steele's research has led him to conclude the SAT is unreliable and unfair.
We're thinking about this thing in the wrong way, as some objective, uncontaminated measure of academic merit. It is not that.
November 30th, 1998. The deadline for submitting an application to Berkeley to become a member of next fall's freshman class.
This envelope, this one little envelope can have a profound effect on which direction your life will going, you know what I mean? Has there been any other people coming in, dropping off applications?
Quite a few.
There are a lot of puzzles in this application.
Well, the one C she got in physics in her junior year gave me pause, but as you can see, she comes right back the next semester with an A.
That C in physics jumps off the page at me.
By January, Berkeley's admissions office is in high gear. 55 readers must now sort through 30,000 applications to choose next year's class. Frontline was granted rare access to observe the process.
And so I opened the application and started looking to see if there were some catastrophic circumstances in the family that would, account for these grades, and I couldn't find anything. It sort of looks like one of those applications filled out on the way to the mailbox.
On November 30th?
Right.
The applications of the 7 kids we followed are not under consideration in this session, but there are many students like them. Students from top schools, like Jonathan and Marlo.
Well, the first thing you notice is the straight A's.
Straight A's, yeah.
And I can't remember if we mentioned this, but look where she is in her school. She's in the 99th percentile for...
And there were students from poor communities like Betsy and J.K.
He comes from a low socioeconomic background. Parents do not have a high school education. He's done very well academically. He's taken the...
By UC policy, Berkeley must admit half of each class based on pure academic criteria: grades, course difficulty, and SAT scores.
Because she's taking, 3 in the 12th grade, which I think is pretty impressive.
Impressive,
Yeah.
I think it will last 2 years.
This is an extraordinary human being.
But in choosing the second half of the class, the school can consider other factors: a student's activities, community service, and ability to overcome obstacles.
He's really achieving in light of not only poor family circumstances, but putting a lot of hours in every week to help support the family. I really like the mature voice, too, that I saw in his essay.
In the end, how much do SAT scores count at Berkeley?
We have no fixed weights in our scoring processes. We have no formulas. We depend upon the trained professional judgment of our readers. So that an SAT 1 verbal score of 600 doesn't have a single meaning across our applicant pool. A score of 600 may mean one thing for a student whose first language isn't English, or whose parents didn't complete high school.
Even though his SAT scores aren't that strong for our pool, he's gone beyond the high school to challenge himself by taking...
Prop 209 mandates that Berkeley can no longer consider race in admissions. But realistically, can Laird's staff ignore it?
On the application itself, the race and ethnicity and gender items are blanked out, so none of our readers see that information when we read the applications. But there are many different ways in which applicants reveal that information about themselves, and so the notion that somehow blocking that one item on the application is going to mask information from the readers is really naive. So I think the answer to the question is that we adhere to the law because it is the law, and we work hard to carry it out.
What academic score shall we recommend for this student?
5, I'm afraid.
5.
5 also. Yeah. I think there are lots of us, though, who are in the middle. I think people who are really supportive of diversity all feel that sense of tension between fidelity to the law of the state of California and our own personal values and the things that many of us have worked for most of our adult lives. And that part is hard.
Beneath Bob Laird's struggle to balance the law and his hopes for diversity lies a debate over a fundamental question. What is the real mission of an elite university like Berkeley?
The end goal of having standardized tests and using GPA is to have the brightest, smartest, most competitive people at the best university, because we believe that furthers the advancement of knowledge. And the Berkeley campus, for better or for worse, was designed to be sort of the jewel of the crown. Right? It's supposed to be a campus that can compete with the best private universities in the world. If we have a system that's designed to get educational excellence, and that's the way that the racial groups happen to fall out after that process, a race-neutral, fair process, and that's the way it's going to be.
We are a university to comprehend the physical universe, but also the social universe, and this social universe is ethnically and racially diverse. And so how can we accomplish our educational mission in terms of helping students understand, comprehend this social universe that is ethnically and racially diverse when our student body itself is not diverse?
The value of racial diversity on college campuses has become a national issue. It may soon be decided by the Supreme Court, spurred by a series of lawsuits focused on test scores. Terrence Pell has sued public universities in Texas, Michigan, and Washington, claiming their affirmative action programs discriminate by applying different test score standards to different races.
This page of data from the University of Michigan admissions office shows a white applicant with this combination of grades and test scores would be rejected out of hand based just on their grades and test scores, whereas a underrepresented minority with the same grades and test scores would be passed on for probable acceptance. That's about as clear an example of a two-track admission system as you could possibly have. And here it is in black and white. It's not that these universities are evil lawbreakers. It's that they are faced with very real disparities in standardized test scores. And any school that uses standardized tests heavily in its admissions process has got to find a way around those disparities. And bureaucratically, the most convenient way to do that is through the illegal use of racial preferences.
Despite the assault on affirmative action at public universities, elite private schools like Harvard, where the meritocracy began 70 years ago, still pursue racial diversity.
We need diversity. Diversity is part of education. You cannot really have a racially diverse student body without taking race into consideration in the admissions process.
In a new book called The Shape of the River, Derek Bach and a former president of Princeton studied the impact of affirmative action at 28 selective universities and found evidence they say proves the dramatic success of minority students.
I think most striking is the leadership they're contributing in civic and community life, the ratios of black matriculants leading civic and community organizations to their white classmates, almost twice in many areas. Very hard choices have to be made in the admission process, and they have to be made not on the basis of who has achieved a certain test score result at this point in their lives, but on the basis of which set of applicants will really contribute most to the quality of education at this institution and to the larger purposes for American society, to the need of the society for diverse leadership.
April 1999. Berkeley and many of America's top universities have decided who they will admit to their next freshman class. In Orinda, Marlo Schindler is awaiting letters from 14 schools, including Berkeley and, most important, Harvard.
There's a big envelope in there from somebody. Pen.
Oh, that's nice. That's
Yeah.
good. Yes.
It is an Ivy League school.
I like UPenn. A lot.
And Harvard wasn't your first choice, hon. It was a shot in the dark. Yeah, I know.
Panel that are going to help us to better understand what we've just seen. And I would ask each of them to limit their remarks to about 5 minutes. And then we'll turn it open to the floor for questions. And let's start with Professor Gary Orfield, who's Professor of Education and Social Policy at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, also has a foot in the Kennedy School, author, among other things, of The Closing Door and Dismantling Desegregation. Gary.
Thank you. What's happened in the country in the last few years is a tremendous increase in the pressure on the most elite universities because of the importance that they have in people's lives. A full-scale attack on affirmative action that has resulted in the loss of affirmative action in our two largest states already, and a major battle all over the country. and a resulting intense focus on what the other tools are that admit the students to these very scarce spaces. California, for example, is expanding its higher education system much slower than its population is expanding. So the population is changing very dramatically. Most of the children in California schools, large majority, are non-white. So you've got huge pressures put on this admissions process. And in that situation, the testing system that has grown up is now being looked at much, much more strictly. And there's been proposals, for example, by the Latino leaders in California to end the use of standardized tests in the higher education system. In this situation, we have to think about what the tests do, what they don't do, and how we can use them appropriately. And I think one of the best guidelines is the guidelines the testing industry and the testing profession themselves put out, which says you should never use a test to make a decision, a critical life decision about a student based on one test score. Many of our colleges and universities around the country disobey that every day, and one of the problems with the relationship between those who are concerned about access and civil rights in the country and the testing industry now is that the testing industry really doesn't enforce its own standards. It works with lots of places that openly violate them and do make decisive decisions based on only one test score. In California, at Berkeley, for example, very large numbers of students get turned down with straight A records solely on the basis of their test scores. At least they get out of the top 1/2 of the student bodies chosen in that kind of way. Obviously, there's going to be a big battle over this now for years to come, and my belief is it's important that we not try to get a simplistic solution. If we get rid of tests, we'll still have the situation that led to the tests, which is we have totally unequal high schools and grades that aren't comparable and very poor information and too few spaces. So we have to think about all the dimensions of it. We have to think about having more opportunities, expanding these systems more. We have to think about upgrading and equalizing the high schools rather than resegregating and making more unequal high schools. We have to think about not giving credit for things that aren't available to all the students, like AP. Special credit is given in admissions to things that literally aren't available in a lot of minority high schools. We have to think about either how to make them available or not to give special credit for it. We have to take the information we can get from the SAT, which is useful but limited, and add to it a much more complex admissions process. Berkeley used to be much more mechanical than it is now. They're now investing in a lot of money in looking at each file because they don't want to have a completely stratified student body. Colleges and universities across the country are going to have to move in that direction, or they're going to be more and more limited. Also, I think that all of this points out how important affirmative action really is and how important it is not to let it go, because the alternatives we have aren't very good and they're very difficult. And to maintain any diversity after you give up affirmative action, you have to have a very strong investment by the leadership of the college and university. And many of our institutions aren't really prepared to make that. So there's a set of complicated patterns and questions. They all come to focus in many places on the testing system, but the problem with the testing system isn't so much inherent in the fact that we're using a test as that we're misusing a test and we're not doing a lot of other things that really need to be done, and that the answer isn't going to be a simple one-dimensional answer. It's going to be a complex and multi-dimensional answer.
Thank you. Lanny Guinier is professor of law at Harvard Law School and author of the recent book, Lift Every Voice, and other books, including the thought-provoking Tyranny of the Majority.
There's not a lot that can be said in 3 minutes. Just as there's not a lot that you can learn that is significant about a person in 3 hours when they take a blind, graded, timed paper and pencil test that values quick, strategic guessing with less than perfect information. There was a part of the film that was not shown where they showed one of the classic questions on the SAT and explained that you would think the answer is 4, but because that's your first thought, you know it's wrong. 6 would be too big, so it must be 5. You don't have to know anything about math in order to answer this question. You just have to know about test strategy. Now, obviously, as students in school, you have learned a lot about test strategy. My concern is that when we focus critical admissions decisions, and I agree with Gary Orfield that the question is really how are we allocating scarce resources in a diverse, multiracial democracy at public institutions that are being subsidized by taxpayers. Do we want to put that much importance on quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information? As a professor, I can assure you that the answer for me is no. I would much rather the student, you heard Claude Steele in this tape say, well, the problem for many black students is that they check their answers and they reread the question. Terrible strategy for doing well on the SAT. Check their answers and reread the question. I would like students who check their answers. In fact, I'd like students who even do a little research before they put down their answer. If I were hiring people for a job, I would much prefer people who have good research skills, good interpersonal skills, have leadership skills, can work with a diverse group of people, have emotional intelligence. And yes, I would like them to do some quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information, but that should not be the most important number or the most important thing that I know about somebody. So I have a big problem with the role that the SAT has played in defining merit, because I think it misdefines merit as quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information. Now, it also happens that this definition of merit has a terrible racial, gender, and what the film does not disclose, class bias. This is not just about race, and it's not just about affirmative action. It is about a decision by a social oligarchy to credentialize itself so it can perpetuate itself in the form of passing on to its children the privilege of attending elite universities. Now, Gary Orfield also said that part of the problem is that the University of California system is not building opportunity, not building classrooms, not making enough opportunity available for the increasing size of the population. Part of the problem is that it is spending public monies to fund prisons rather than systems of higher education. And then it is tracking one set of kids to college, right, giving them test prep and all of the other coaching, and another set of kids is being tracked to prison. Now, that is a decision that needs to be discussed more openly, in my view. This is not simply about the SAT. This is about how, as a society, we are making those important decisions about allocating scarce resources. And the reason it's a big question is because, and I agree here with several of the commentators who were interviewed, this is about the mission of higher education in a multiracial democracy. Is an opportunity to go to Berkeley a reward that should be allocated to people based on how well they did on a test? Or should it be a system that is designed to promote citizenship, to train leaders, to prepare people for the workforce in the 21st century, where we are not interested in quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information, because in fact you can get information, right? This is the information world. This is the information economy. So part of what we need to think about is a 21st century definition of the role of higher education. We are stuck in an 18th century definition of higher education. So this is a much bigger question than the SAT, and it's a much bigger question than affirmative action, and it's a much bigger question than race. Affirmative action has been a useful way of propping up the SAT and helping us not focus on some of its flaws. But without affirmative action, this is an opportunity now to look at the issue of admission to higher education in the context not simply of race, not simply of gender, not simply of class, but what is the mission of these institutions for a 21st century democracy.
Next is Wayne Kamara. Mr. Kamara is Executive Director of Research at the College Board, which administers the SAT. Welcome.
Certainly in most of our discussions about this issue, the SAT is the focus of what is wrong in education or how decisions are made. But the basic problem is in our society, we have scarce resources and we have to make allocations. Only so many individuals can ever possibly get into Berkeley. Only so many individuals can ever possibly be employed by Microsoft or by the state of New Jersey. As a researcher and as a parent, I face this as well. I was in my daughter's open house. In 8th grade, I was told that my daughter's score was while nationally at the 90th percentile, locally in our district, it was at the 55th percentile. And they would recommend she not go into algebra until she were in 9th grade, not in 8th grade. And this is a fairly affluent, very heavily educated community. But here we're using a test score on a standardized 8th grade test to say that students who are at the 90th percentile nationally probably shouldn't go into algebra for another year, not because they can't succeed, but because there is something, I believe, about our culture that wants certain students to excel above others. We often talk about the advanced placement course, and I hear lots of good-meaning people tell me that what we really want to do is ensure that all students can get a 5. That is, all students who take AP, it would be wonderful if all students who took AP Calculus or Biology got a 5. I'm equally convinced that parents, and many of you, when you're parents, would kill me if all students got a 5, because the argument would be, my son or daughter is better than that. If your test is showing 90% of students getting a 5, it's not good enough. I was amused and also depressed by some headlines in the New York Times just in the last 2 days. 2 days ago, they ran a story about the City University and the low number of students who passed the exams in New York City. Today, on the front page, they ran a story that showed that 55% of students passed the new Regents exams. Therefore, the test can't be good. How dare 55% of students be doing good? We know our students aren't any good, so we've got to make the tests more difficult. So I think the difficulty we have here, and some of the subgroup differences we find with tests, and a lot of my time has been devoted to research on tests, not just the SAT, but employment tests. And one question I always ask, and I would ask you, whether it's an employment test or whether it's an SAT, is simply to really think through what we would do in its place. I agree wholeheartedly with the panelists who say that we have overemphasized the use of tests. Universities and schools have overemphasized it, but that is small compared to the overemphasis that the media and the general public has given these tests. In reality, admissions officers in most schools tell us that the SAT is about 20 to 25% weight, that the number one weight by far is the high school grades, and number two, a distant second, is the quality of the courses the student takes, and a close third is the SAT, and other things like essay and references follow. But let's just think about other factors like grades and like GPA. Well, first of all, I understand that students prep for the SAT. But has anyone here heard about students in high school or elementary school whose parents get tutors so that their children can do well in algebra or in plain geometry or in English? I certainly have. Has anyone here heard about students whose parents send them to computer classes after school, supplementary education, not in 12th grade to take a test, but in 3rd grade, in kindergarten, in pre-kindergarten? There is an elitist attitude that pervades education, that pervades society. The SAT is a good scapegoat for that, but if we want to really think that grades and GPA are fair, let's look at the differences there. The subgroup differences on GPA and on class rank are as large as they are with the SAT. 19% of African American college-bound students tell us that they're in the top 5% of their graduating class. 48% of Asian Americans tell us they're in the top 5% of their graduating class, and 41% of whites. There are tremendous differences in class rank in high school. Self-report data. The same data exists for A and B averages in high schools. And when we do look at the research, these are class differences, and these class differences pervade the SAT, they pervade the National Assessment of Educational Progress that's administered in 4th grade. They pervade grades. They pervade the quality of the schools that our children are going to. And so to simply suggest that getting rid of the ACT, the SAT, and all the standardized tests puts things on an even par is much too simplistic. What we need to do, and what we do not have a national will to do, is address why the opportunity to learn, the quality of education is so disparate across this country. And until we're willing to look at the funding of education, the quality of teachers, the training and the respect that we give the teaching and education in the country, we will have these disparities. The problem is farther down, but yes, I agree wholeheartedly that anything we can do to get the message across that the SAT is a crude measure, it's a valuable tool, but it is a crude measure, and we need to consider a lot more when we're making admissions decisions than one test score. And I wholeheartedly support those comments.
Thank you. Mike Chandler, do you have some remarks you'd like to make?
Actually, no, I'd rather hear questions from the audience. I would just say, just briefly, in doing the interviews for the film, that what I found was that where people stand on this test does not break down into the normal liberals over here and conservatives. It's sort of like, to bastardize, psychometrics makes strange bedfellows. You know, we have Lonnie Guinier agreeing basically with Terence Pell from the Center for Individual Rights on the weaknesses of the test, and on the other hand, John Yoo, whom you saw in the film, agreeing with Derek Bach on their strengths. And what the film was designed to do was to provoke exactly this kind of debate. In the wake of 209, what is our standard for admission? What are we really leaning on? And there are people who will defend the use of the test and the sole use of the test as a scientific measure of absolute ability. And the film was designed to say, should we really be doing that?
All right. Let's take questions from the floor. We have 2 microphones down here on the floor. And I would ask only that it be a question and not an extended editorial statement. Yes, sir.
A question for the filmmaker. Does this film pretend to fairness in its study of the issue? I noticed a slanting in the selection of the students whose lives we were following, a slanting in the selection of the experts that we listened to, a slanting in the selection of the research that we were exposed to. I found very little of the psychometric expertise that one panelist brought in what we saw. Perhaps it's balanced in some other way, but given that this is on TV and is meant to influence a policy debate, and typically Frontline, well, does it go under the heading of advocacy or does it go under the heading of journalism?
It goes under the heading of journalism, and I think if you watch the entire show, you'll see that it is balanced. I think that what you do is you have to, the kids that you saw there illustrate various points. The other ones in the film do the same thing. If you look at it in toto, I think you'll get a balanced viewpoint. There's certain intellectual, film can only, to a certain extent, be anecdotal. It can only go to the things you film. The experts in the film, though, I believe, give a back and forth between themselves that does discuss the issues.
Did you, just a little bit of a follow-up,
short question, please.
Did you, the filmmakers, typically when a social scientist explores an issue, it's a good idea if he or she approaches it without a preconceived idea of how it's going to come out. Did the filmmakers, the reason that you became involved in this, or the reason that you all got together on the project, or it was funded, did that have anything to do with having a position on this issue?
No, I think what you do as a journalist is you investigate. I conducted almost 24 interviews, and what you do is you find out as you go what your story is, and you put it together.
Question over here on the other side, please.
Hi, my name is Lisa Brightman, and I'm a graduate student here at Harvard University, and I greatly enjoyed watching the Frontline. Actually, I didn't watch it, but I listened to it. I'm totally blind, and I was just wondering, talking about the balance, why were not people with disabilities considered in this? Considering people with disabilities, there's approximately 54 Americans who have a disability in this country. And I was wondering, why were people with disabilities not looked into, as far as, you know, if you want to make knowledge and, oh gosh, I'm lost here.
Well, that's all right.
But I was just wondering why people with disabilities were not looked into for this study. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's the same answer I gave this gentleman. You only have, I mean, in 53 minutes, there's only so much ground you can cover. There's only so many kids you can bring into it. I tried to bring in as broad a cross-section as I could. Lonnie was mentioning the fact that class has not really been raised in the film, and that's because, given the constraints of finding the kids, I couldn't really come up with a good example of that. I would have liked to. I think it would have helped the film to have emphasized the class differences along with the race differences. But you have to pick the topics you want to emphasize, and that's what happens.
Thank you.
Please.
My name is Adam Taylor. I'm a first year at the Kennedy School. I want to thank the panel and the movie, first of all, for really critiquing and attacking the merits, or the demerits, really, of the SAT as an indicator for college success. But I want to ask a question on the other side of the debate in terms of what universities are doing to construct a very convincing and compelling policy rationale as to why diversity as a value in college admissions has a lot of strength and has a lot of merit and should be a very strong criteria in college admissions. And I'm wondering what the panel's experience is in terms of universities who claim that they want to promote and respect and value diversity, but then on the other hand are not showing that and reflecting that in their college admissions.
I could start that off. Our project, the Civil Rights Project here at Harvard, is looking at this issue very intensively, and we're going to publish a book on the consequences of diversity later this year. This summer we released a study that was done of law students at Harvard Law School and Michigan Law School to show what the actual consequences of being in an interracial class were in terms of what students learned, how their understanding changed, and to what extent there really were effects that were independent of just other kinds of background differences. And the study showed tremendously powerful intellectual effects on how students understood criminal law and how they understood civil rights, how they understood many other substantive issues. And this is really what the Supreme Court was talking about in the Bakke decision. They were talking about that there were intellectual consequences of having students from diverse backgrounds. And it's what the Court of Appeals rejected in the Texas case where they outlawed affirmative action. So this kind of research is important. The University of Michigan, which is facing 2 lawsuits on this issue right now, has taken the unusual step of sponsoring a lot of basic research. And they've recently published and released a number of important studies that really move this forward. There's a lot of young researchers around the country that are looking into this issue on many different levels now. It's true that for the first 20 years of affirmative action, the universities really dropped the ball in terms of doing the basic research. They're now trying to catch up belatedly.
Professor Guarneri, do you have a response also?
Well, I just want to, in some sense, try to redirect the conversation just a little. Part of the question is not, is diversity something that should be considered as an add-on to the more fundamental question of who is, quote, meritorious, but is diversity, in fact, one of the most fundamental aspects of a university or the mission of a public institution. And diversity does not mean, in my view, simply positioning people who look different in a classroom. Diversity involves changing the nature of the curriculum within the university, changing the nature of the relationship between faculty and students, having a commitment to training people not only to learn how to do quick strategic guessing, but to learn how to problem solve in diverse groups so that you can come up with imaginative, innovative, and workable solutions to real problems. So that I see the whole question of diversity as a challenge to the fundamental mission of universities in the 21st century. And it is not solved simply by changing cosmetically the composition of the student body, or even cosmetically changing the composition of the faculty, but really trying to understand how can universities do their job well to meet the challenges of an increasingly diverse, and not just demographically diverse, but in terms of function, diverse world. People do not simply go alone and try and solve a problem sitting in their own cubicle and come up with the answer. People problem solve in teams, so you've got to learn how to work in teams. That's a fundamental challenge that all of us will face in the 21st century, and in that sense, diversity becomes the core value of the university.
We have time for one more question, please.
Yeah, hi. Robert Lee from the Graduate School of Education here. I had a question for Mr. Kimura. The frontline piece raises a lot of questions about the effects of test prep on the scores, and whether this is any kind of true test. I think I wanted to hear, because I've heard the College Board claim that it's a very nominal difference, and I wanted, maybe we could get some more information about those numbers. A lot of us here understand statistics. Maybe you can talk about whether it's really 30 points or whether some people go up 200 points and other people don't improve at all, and what kind of students and from what kind of demographic backgrounds, how they're all influenced by test prep.
Sure. I mean, basically what I would say honestly is that not that test prep doesn't matter, but that test prep seems to have a very small effect. It has that same effect on males and females and African American, Hispanic and white and Asian students. And the only caveat I would give you is that if you begin with an extremely high score, and this is regression to the mean effects, but if you begin with an extremely high score, if a student who begins with a 1250 and wants to get the 1580 to get into Berkeley, well, they've got a difficult time to get that high because they already are significantly above the average. The studies we have done, you can discount outright if you wish. Look at the studies that have done by independent academics, and I mean, the worst way to do this study is to simply have students take a practice test. For me, I'm doing the tutoring. I'll give you a practice test under less than optimal motivation conditions. You won't do all that well, and then I will give you my intervention. You will wait a year, you'll take the actual test, you will go up, and I'll say, see, my students went up 200 points. The fact is that, yeah, about 12% of students who have gone to independent coaching firms went up 100 points on their SAT math. 12%. But 8% of students who went to no coaching went up 100 points. So you can go up 100 points, you can have a sizable gain on an SAT. Slightly more likely to do that if you go to coaching than if you don't go to coaching. But it's still a small effect. The average effect that we've shown is around 25 points. There have been 3 or 4 very good, rigorous meta-analysis which have not looked at a small sample, but have actually combined results from many other samples, not including our own studies done by academics. 3 or 4 of them out there, they're on our webpage, that show the exact same numbers. They all range from a low of about 18 points to about 35 points. But yes, are there students who will go up 200 points after coaching? There certainly are. Are there students who go up 200 points without coaching? Yes, there certainly are.
Well, we thank you for coming, and the forum clearly would like to thank Michael Chandler and Frontline, Mr. Kimura, Professors Guinier and Orfield. And I do have one announcement. If you want to get involved in the issues tonight, if you're a student, there's a group of Harvard students. It's called Get Ready, and they provide free SAT test preparation for inner city high school students, and their goal is to promote social equity through free SAT preparation, college advising, and advocacy around immigrant testing rights. And if you're interested in that, if you would go after this session to right in front of the Institute of Politics, there will be someone there to lead you further. And thank you very much for coming tonight.
I love Amadeus. I like watching it got all my kids. Excuse me.
places, yes. Okay, we'll be in touch. At
The place
end
beyond
of Harvard
Charles?
Square, because that's where my...
Okay, all right.